And it turns out that if you read like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others on the reciprocal relationship between faith and action, you get exactly that same dialectic. Faith, as Paul discovered on the Damascus Road, may lead to a change into a different kind of action, but it's also true that if you want to believe and have faith, don't just sit there on your duff. Act as if you believe.
Welcome to another conversation with Science for the Church, where we talk to scientists, practitioners, theologians, Bible scholars to learn about the connection between faith and science. And I'm really excited today. I have to confess, my favorite is when we get to talk to the scientists and learn from them how the work they do is relevant and can inform what we do in the church. So I'm really excited today to have social psychologist Dave Myers. Dave has been at Hope College since I believe it's 1967, a long career in one location. He's written extensively, over 15 books, including a number of popular textbooks. We'll talk more about those in a moment, and a number of general audience books. And so he's had quite a prolific career as a teacher, a researcher, and as a communicator of psychology. We'll include this later so you can get a link to it, but his Talk Psychology, Talk Psych blog with Macmillan Learning is a really fantastic resource. And so we're really excited because Dave is also a Christian, and he's done a lot of work helping us understand connections between Christian faith and psychology. And so Dave and I crossed paths in Templeton Foundation circles for a number of years. And I'm just really excited to talk with you today, Dave, and learn from you and dive deeper into some of your research and some of your motivations for why you do psychology and why you connect it to faith and to the church. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Rick. It's a delight to be here with you and to connect again.
Indeed, indeed. So let's kind of start sort of back at the beginning. What led you to pursue psychology? What led you down the path to spend all of these years studying psychology and communicating it?
Rick, I tell students that my life story is what their life story will be. Namely, it's an unpredictable future. So I grew up in Seattle, Washington, in a business family. I worked in my father's insurance agency. I actually became the state's youngest licensed insurance salesman after passing an exam at age 16, but never sold a policy. Went off to Whitworth University in Spokane, thinking instead I'd be a doctor. So I majored in chemistry, minored in biology. And then after working 3 summers in Seattle's County Hospital, taking the medical college admissions test, half completing my applications to medical school, I decided I did not want to become a doctor. And so I never mailed in those applications. And I thought back to the one psych class I had had back in my first year. And I thought, I think I'd like to become a professor. And that might be a cool subject. And so even with a strong science background, but not a lot of psychology courses, I applied to graduate school and got in. When I arrived at the University of Iowa, having said I was interested in personality psychology, I met my mentor and he said, sorry, Dave, but the person we had in that area just left, so we moved you into social psych. And that's how I became a social psychologist. And then I wanted to end up as a teacher at a student-centered institution, which is where I am, a place called Hope College. But that, as our conversation will unfold, led to some unanticipated further things happening. And so again, the lesson I tell students is you may think you know, if you're a high school senior, for example, what it is you want to study and do. But my confident prediction is that your future is something different from what you're now thinking. And that's why an education that prepares you for the future you can't predict, to think smart, to know who you are, what your values are, how to communicate, and so forth, and to have broad awareness of the world around you. That's the future that's going to prepare you for the sometimes distressing and disappointing and sometimes exciting and surprising things to come.
Yep. I have to say I resonate with that story as a most of my time in college as a physics and English double major. I had no idea I'd be founding and leading a ministry called Science for the Church back when I was a college student. So that unpredictability is very real in my life for sure.
Right. And
Um,
in most of our listeners' lives, I'm sure.
Indeed, indeed. So I imagine a number of folks watching, listening to this conversation have actually engaged with your work, maybe unknowingly, through your extensive, I'll use the term franchise of textbooks. I think there's now over 50 editions and over 20 languages. The AP Psych textbook, the main one, I think is the one that you have produced. Tell us a little bit about what led you to take on writing textbooks and sticking with it for all of these editions.
So again, that was another part of that unpredictable future, Drew. It was not my idea to do textbook authoring, but the phone rang one day in January of 1979 and was an editor from McGraw-Hill asking if I'd be interested in working on and possibly co-authoring and ultimately authoring a social psychology text. And like, you got to be kidding. Why are you calling me at Hope College? And it turned out that I should back up before that. When I came to Hope, I unexpectedly got engaged in a particular research puzzle that I started on in graduate school. It had to do with how group discussion polarizes opinions. And that led to some National Science Foundation grants and some publications that allowed me to become an expert in this narrow niche of a problem. And that led to an invitation to join 7 other Americans at a research conference with 16 Europeans in Germany for 5 days as we sat around a U-shaped table. And I think of this as providence, but the seating lottery placed me the first day and throughout the conference next to a well-known University of Massachusetts social psychologist. These were all much more famous people than me. And so I naturally got to know him. And then this was in the summer, the next winter, he was given this invitation by McGraw-Hill and said, no, but you should call David Myers at Hope College. If he hadn't thought to drop my name in that conversation, we wouldn't be having this conversation today because it changed my life. I mean, it changed my whole vocational focus, shifting to not just teaching in the classroom, but teaching through writing and not just textbooks, but the general audience books and the blog essays and so forth that spun off from that. So and then when that book finished, came an invitation to do an introductory psychology text, an invitation that came from my editor, who had now moved over to what is now Macmillan Learning, and that ended up becoming a whole, as you say, and as they say, franchise of books of different levels of introductory psych texts for different audiences.
Right. Wow. I mean, it's incredible. I think I saw a picture online where all of them were side by side on your website
Yeah.
or somewhere. And I mean, I have to say, I wouldn't want to read every edition front to back. That's a lot of text there
Right.
that you produced.
Yeah. And I don't want anybody to think that this has all been a story of success because I've published trade books that have sold very few copies. I've had many op-ed essays, many more rejected than accepted and published. And so, as any academic knows, you got to cast a lot of lines in the water to catch a fish. And so, a career, whether you're a pastor or an academic, is not all success. Not everybody relates to your preaching. Not every sermon scores. Not every book idea leads to anything productive. But it just so happens that these textbooks for social psychology and then introductory psychology have, uh, have simply given me the deep honor and responsibility of talking to millions of students about life relevant matters.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. So let's transition a little bit into your kind of Christian faith that you engage with very openly in a lot of your writing and your scholarship. Tell us a little bit about your personal faith journey.
Well, I grew up in a family of faith, and as a Presbyterian in Seattle, attended Bible camps and church camps and so forth, and embraced the faith, and then followed my siblings to the Christian Presbyterian College, where my dad was a trustee. There was never any question about that. And to this day, I wake up each morning and read the lectionary text and engage in prayer. And so my faith is uh, central to who I am. And amidst all the doubts and uncertainties and angst over what Christianity has become associated with in today's world, it's still central to who I am. And by the way, I've tried to, as we'll discuss a little bit, I'm sure, tried to ask how my Christian faith, and in particular, biblical understandings of human nature and theological understandings, connect with what psychological science and neuroscience are revealing.
Let's go there. Tell us a little bit about kind of how you see the connection. I was going to ask you more generally faith and science, how you see that connection, but we can go straight into
Yeah,
the connection with the
yeah.
science that you do.
Well, I'd say first, I mean, I see my faith as a very science supported faith. I'm part of a tradition that calls itself reformed and ever reforming. Uh, and it at least mandates, if it doesn't always practice, a spirit of humility that is grounded in theism. And if one is a theist, no matter what variety, there's two things you believe. One is that there's a God, and the second is that it's not you and it's not me. And thus, the surest conviction I can have is that some of my beliefs err. I am fallible. I'm a finite creature. And thus, I should approach every question kind of with, I should approach others' views with a, not cynicism, but open-minded skepticism, always asking, what do you mean? How do you know? Because you might be wrong, but also with a spirit of humility that acknowledges I might be wrong. And thus, on matters where science is pertinent, where observation and experimentation can shed light on some important matter, it's important to look at the data, to listen to God's world as well as God's word, if you will. And so that scientific attitude, which is embraced here at Hope College, where sciences are the strongest departments. We've got 170 students working full time in research in summer, and we've turned out so much scientific research. That's not allowed by or tolerated by our Reformed faith. It's mandated by it. It's encouraged and supported by it. So that's the foundational basis for what I'm doing.
Say a bit more then with the connection directly in questions of human nature and the psychological sciences and neuroscience.
Sure. So then we can look at, certain things we've come to understand in psychological science, such as, let me just to name a couple. One would be the phenomenon of self-serving bias. There's a mountain of evidence that we tend to see and present ourselves in favorable ways to attribute bad things that happen to external events, but to accept credit for good things that happen to us, and so forth. And as I thought about this, I thought, that's like the or the theological idea of pride, which is the foundational sin of the seven deadly sins, seeing oneself more highly than one ought to, maybe, which can lead to a lot of conflict in relationships. If you and a spouse each see yourself as deserving more credit and less responsibility for bad things, for credit for good things and less responsibility for bad things, than the other. That can lead to interpersonal conflict. It can lead to international conflict. It can lead to uh, lots of disharmony in the workplace and so forth. And so pride and self-serving bias. Or here's another, just to use another example. Social psychologists talk a lot about the reciprocal relationships between attitudes and behavior. Attitudes influence behavior, but it's also true that our behaviors influence our attitudes. We tend to come to believe what we've enacted, and so if we get people to act in a particular way, they'll to rehearse their support of something they may have doubts about, they'll come to believe it more strongly. And it turns out that if you read like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others on the reciprocal relationship between faith and action, you get exactly that same dialectic. Faith as Paul discovered on the Damascus Road, may lead to a change into a different kind of action. But it's also true that if you want to believe and have faith, don't just sit there on your duff. Act as if you believe, as
Yeah.
Pascal advised. Say the masses, take the holy waters, and so forth. And by doing so, you will find faith.
Yep.
So those are just kind of two examples of kind of theological and psychological science literatures connecting. And then I would say, if I had to say a third thing, it would be our understanding of who we are as embodied creatures.
Okay.
Nothing psychological exists without the underlying biology. Every thought, every emotion is also simultaneously a brain event. And this, relates to kind of the theological debate over who we are. Are we embodied creatures? To use the Old Testament word nephesh, are we embodied creatures who die at the end of life, but who have hope of new life grounded in God's promise of resurrection? Or are we, thinking more dualistically, does mind exist separate from body, and could it? And should we think of ourselves as having immortal souls that never die, rather just pass away? Well, I think today's cognitive neuroscience, which so intimately links mind and brain, is congenial to the biblical understanding that we are embodied creatures, that death is real, but the Easter hope is also real, and it's a hope of resurrection, not of immortality.
Hmm. Wonderful. Good stuff. Tell us a little bit about your experience in the church. How is it sounds like you've been a part of the church from childhood. How has the church supported you through grad school and through your many years at Hope? How has that connection been?
I mean, I say it nurtures and sustains my faith in a community that in which I find friendship and support. Uh, it also, my church gives opportunity it gives voice to scientists. We have an active adult ed program. And so last Sunday, for example, we had an astronomer speaking on the wonders of the universe and multiverse and how this expands her understanding of God and her awe for the creative process that led to this marvelous universe. I've done a couple talks this year based on psychological science and how it relates to faith. And we have others coming in to do the same. And so the church can allow scientists to share what they're learning and discovering and what they're thinking about how it relates to their faith. And then I think the church can also do a couple other things. It can encourage that spirit of humility, that openness, that curiosity that is foundational to the scientific spirit. And it can, I was going to say the other thing. Oh, the other thing is, I think the church can do help with public education. The, One of the greatest sources of misinformation today is people's judging reality on the basis of mere anecdotes rather than on the basis of evidence. Science is evidence-based thinking. And by the way, this can cut both ways. There's, a little over half of Americans think that immigrants are dangerous and criminal and so forth, and thus we need to get them out of this country based on Laken Riley's murder by a Venezuelan undocumented immigrant and a few other horrific incidents. Even though all the data indicate that immigrants actually have a lower than average rate of incarceration, if you look at the data and not just the horrific incidents. At the other end of the continuum, progressive people believe that police are killing 100 or 1,000 or more people of color in the United States each year because they have vivid images of that horrific killing of George Floyd and a few other such incidents, when in fact that's a relatively rare thing. And so part of our public education as educators is to try to get people to think in terms of data and evidence and not just anecdote and story. Although stories that touch the heart as well as the head are very important to preaching and effective communication. But we also need to, as pastors and as scientists and as educators, to help people think about what's really true, and you discern that by looking at representative at all the stories that we can gather, not just isolated stories. And all the stories means data.
Yep. So tell me a little bit about your experience as a Christian in psychology. I know we talk to different scientists and we hear different things. Some are more received as a Christian in their scientific communities than they are as a scientist in their Christian communities. For others, it's the opposite. Some have good experiences with both. What's your experience been within the psychological community as someone who openly writes about your Christian faith, and teaches at a Christian university?
Sure. I think for the most part, it's been positive. There have been stories I've heard over the years of representatives for competing textbooks letting people know that this guy is a Christian in a field where there are few Christians in academia, in psychological science, proportionately few. However, I am so wholeheartedly embracing of science and letting it lead us where it will, and believing that all truth is God's truth. And if something challenges my beliefs or yours, we're going to follow the evidence and data. And so being a person of faith who is open about that, but also very openly supportive of rigorous, unbridled, free inquiry, I think has enabled people to accept who I am. And perhaps in some cases, even to know that it helps to have some folks like me able to talk to fellow people of faith, as you are doing through your ministry, Drew, about how science can enhance and not just challenge faith.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's important to have that balance. There are those areas where we have honest questions that we need spaces to wrestle with, but there's other areas where
Oh,
there's
yes. And so, for example, I mean, I have a book that's subtitled The Christian Case for Gay Marriage, and it's really about the science that supports both the importance of marriage and covenant partnerships for human flourishing. That's a conservative position, but it does that inclusively based on what we've come to understand about sexual orientation, which is not a moral choice for nearly everyone. And healthy covenant relationships are just a better way to live life. So, I mean, that's a kind of a very cheap synopsis of trying to make a case, particularly at the time this book was published 20 years ago, to fellow people of faith that here's some evidence we need to take into consideration.
right, right. So I know you can keep going on this, so I want to come back to it. Your textbooks cover the range of the psychological sciences. Tell us a few more areas where you think, psychology should be material in that book should be more widely known and utilized in the church that could help clergy do more effective ministry or unpack biblical narratives in richer ways or improve children or youth ministry. What are some other insights from the psychological sciences that churches would benefit from knowing?
Sure. So there's practical things like how to create memorable, persuasive messages. I mean, both cognitive psychology and social psychology would have something to contribute to that conversation. And by the way, I have a little book co-authored with my UK psychological scientist friend Malcolm Jeeves entitled Psychology Through the Eyes of Faith. And this goes into more of this if anybody's interested. I would say in today's world, one of the real concerns I have is the spread of misinformation and disinformation. And psychological science and the church can help that. Now, this becomes a really kind of sensitive, difficult matter for pastors. Pastors, like textbook authors, by the way, I feel your pain, pastors, have diverse audiences, and you want to speak to everybody in a way that's respectful of all and sensitive to all. But you also have a challenge to discern and give witness to truth, as do I in talking to my diverse audience. And sometimes that means helping people get past misinformation. And so part of what we do in our textbook and in our teaching is, first of all, give some striking examples of misinformation that's rampant. To give you one example, Every year, 7 in 10 or more Americans tell Gallup there's more crime this year in the United States than there was the prior year. Last year, they said the same thing, even though over the last 40 years, both property crime and violent crime have gone down by all measures. And so what people are believing is simply not true. And people's misperceptions of what is true about this, about other matters pertaining to the economy, to immigration, and so forth, is driving a lot of the polarization in the United States, and as well as driving people to vote the way they do. And so I'm not saying how people should vote, but a civil democracy is going to function well when it's based on truth rather than on misinformation. And so part of what we have come to understand is what's driving this in misinformation and how to challenge it. And so that's a certainly a topic of interest to me too.
Let's stay on that topic of polarization. It's one that we've done some work on. We've done a conversation like this with your colleague at Hope, Daryl von Tongeren, and his
Right.
work on humility. You've mentioned humility multiple times here. I know a lot of your work on flourishing. I want to get to that in a moment. Talks a lot about social connection and relationship being, so important and valuable to us. Give us a few more thoughts on polarization and what the psychological sciences might be able to bring to the church to actually help the church navigate it. I mean, there are some churches that are all on one side or the other, but I think the vast majority have some division within them and are really struggling today to figure out how do we navigate these differences.
Exactly. That's what makes life miserable for pastors sometimes,
Mhm.
is having oh, to to walk between a rock and a hard place within their own congregation.
Yep.
So, and as it happens, I did my doctoral work in that initial research in social
Right.
psychology on what's called group polarization. And what these experiments done by our own lab and other people's labs found is that when people are clustered with others of like mind to discuss issues about which they differ, they tend to become more strong in the views that they begin with. And so in one experiment, we grouped high prejudice high school students with other relatively high prejudice students and low prejudice students with their own kind to discuss some racial issues like open housing versus property rights, for example, and some down to earth case studies. At the end of those discussion periods, the high prejudice people were even more prejudicial in their response, and the low prejudice people even more kind of anti-racist in their responses. That is, the gap between them had increased. Little did I know how today's internet and multiple cable channels was going to put this phenomenon on steroids. Now we don't have Walter Cronkite giving a common stream of facts to all Americans. We can each go find our own tribe, our own truth, if you will. Isolate ourselves in silos with other people, and thus that polarization increases. And as a result, much more today than, I mean, go back 15 or 20 years, about 20% of Democrats and Republicans say they hated those in the other party. Now that's up to about 50%.
Mhm.
So polarization is a real problem. And boy, do I empathize with pastors having to navigate it. There is some good news, though. I have a wonderful colleague at the University of Chicago who's become a good friend, Nicholas Epley, coming out with a new book before long on the benefits of engaging people in what they think are going to be awkward conversations. Now, some of these conversations happen just, he incentivizes people on subway trains or in other, simple contexts to reach out to somebody and start a conversation and have a significant conversation about who they are and who the other person is. And people think this is going to be awkward, but it almost always turns out to be very rewarding. In some of these conversations, researchers have asked people to have a conversation about a difficult subject about which they disagree. Maybe it's immigration or whatever. And they think this is going to be a horrible experience. Overwhelmingly, it's a positive experiences.
Hmm.
And now we have some national organizations like Braver Angels that have kind of a script almost for bringing reds and blues together to have a conversation about their differences, at the end of which they still differ, but at least they have a better understanding rather than a stereotype about what the other's views are. And they may discover that underneath their differences are some common values that they aspire to. Healthy children and stable marriages and a strong economy or whatever. The differences are over how to get there. So, what have I said? Polarization is real and it's exacerbated by social media and cable channels and residential attitudinal segregation that allows us to kind of find our own people and become more extreme as we like hot coals feed off each other. But the good news is that if you can get people together to have civil conversation across their differences, surprisingly often it works and it helps. And so that's something the church can help structure in adult ed programs, for example.
Yep.
A long answer to a great question.
Right. Just to dive a little bit deeper to try to really get practical, does that research make any distinction between having that conversation with a stranger versus someone you know? Because in churches, it's not a stranger typically that you would have them with. It's someone that you've known oftentimes for many, many years. Does that dynamic change, do you know?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of, and but I would say, as I think about the people that I know in my church, I know them, but I often don't know them at the level of the conversation we'd be having,
Right.
because what I know them is at a more superficial level.
Hmm.
So if you're asked to, I mean, saying this has to be structured wisely, but what do you care about most? What matters? And just share ideas and listen to and reflect what each other's saying. I mean, there's a process. And again, an organization like Braver Angels, has some materials that can help facilitate this kind of conversation that can help moderate polarization, can help bring down the temperature. Uh, Even so, pastors are then speaking to the whole congregation. And again, they're like a textbook author having to speak to student readers who include leftist Democrats and MAGA Republicans, and yet you're trying to discern and give witness to truth while respecting them all. And sometimes truth doesn't drive down the middle of the road.
Right. Right. Indeed. So let's change gears slightly. You've done a lot of work on, I think you've got a couple books on kind of positive psychology and happiness. The language we've tended to use at Science for the Church is around flourishing, and a lot on the connections between Christian faith and flourishing. Tell us a little bit about some of that research and those connections between what we do in our churches and in our Christian practices and flourishing.
Sure. So I, as a spinoff from my text writing, became aware of new research on kind of the scientific predictors of human happiness. And that led me to write a book published in 1991 titled The Pursuit of Happiness. And ever since, to follow research on what does and doesn't predict people's experience of happiness and life satisfaction. And that led my friend Marty Seligman, who's the founder of the positive psychology movement, to invite me to join some other more senior scholars in mentoring some young people in this emerging field of what has come to be called positive psychology, which I've followed ever since. And then as a Templeton trustee, I was privileged to help add my voice of support for what has become the $43 million global flourishing study, which has just revealed its first wave of results from more than 200,000 people in 22 countries sampled by Gallup under the leadership of Tyler Vanderweel and Byron Johnson at Harvard and Baylor, respectively. So uh, that's kind of my background. And, when it comes to happiness, for example, I mean, there are certain things I'm very interested in the relationship of money and income and wealth, or the lack of such relationship to happiness. And we can talk about that if you're interested. You might be more interested in the relationship of religious engagement and happiness. And
Let's
here,
let's do a
the
brief on both. I'd love to hear. I mean, I think a lot of people associate needing to be at a certain income level in order to feel like they're flourishing. And my sense is some of the data challenges that a little bit
Yes, what you
or
get is a
nuances it.
yeah is a curvilinear relationship between income and happiness. So when you go from very low income to up to middle income in today's dollars, 75,000 to $100,000, happiness does increase. You have more income security. You can afford life's necessities. You don't have to worry how you're going to make the next month's rent payment, for example.
Mhm.
Once you get above that, what's called income satiation point at about $100,000 or so, there's diminishing returns from further increases in income. This is also true across countries, by the way. Very poor countries are less happy, more miserable places than middle income countries, but high income countries have no happier people than middle income countries.
Mhm.
So that's sort of, money and wealth matters up to a point. By the way, in terms of wealth, once a person has $1 million, having 5 million or $10 million leads to no further increase in happiness beyond that. And so bringing this back to the church, as somebody who's been blessed with wealth through the income from these textbooks, you know, what am I to do with it? If I spend it on myself, well, this research says it's not going to make me any happier. And so why not think Christianly about the stewardship of wealth? And so that's another kind of church relevant, I guess,
Yeah.
point that I hadn't even thought about bringing up in this conversation.
Let's dive into that religious participation and flourishing, the other point that you mentioned, because I think there is definitely interest in that among our audience.
And so here we have an interesting kind of mixed picture of results. First, in the United States and in other relatively religious countries, and generally true across the world, religious engagement is predictive of happiness. So, for example, in the General Social Survey conducted out of the University of Chicago over the last half century, we have 63,000 randomly sampled Americans now in this massive data pool. Of those who are never religiously engaged, 25% have declared themselves very happy when asked, taking all things together, how would you say things are these days? Would you say you're very happy, pretty happy, or not too happy? Among those who are engaged in attending religious services more than once a week, it's 47% very happy. Other surveys done by Gallup just more recently have confirmed that religious attendance is correlated with people's self-rated satisfaction in life. The new Global Flourishing Study, 200,000 people from 22 nations, finds that religiously engaged people are more likely to be very happy. And likely they are because religious engagement is a social support network. It's a meaning system. It's a basis for having a purpose in one's life. It helps you control your impulses. It enables you, if you experience grace and God's love, to accept yourself. It helps you cope with the idea, the eventual terror, as we call it, of your own death. I mean, these are all kind of psychological consequences of an active faith and religious engagement. That's point number one. So, religious engagement across individuals is predictive of happiness. By the way, despite the fact that highly religious individuals tend to have lower income than less religious individuals. So that's kind of curious too. There is another finding though, and skeptics will bring this up, and that is if you compare highly religious places like states in the United States or highly religious countries to less religious places, you get the reverse relationship. Now, this is really weird. So let's compare, say, Alabama or Georgia or Mississippi, highly religious states, to Vermont, Oregon, Massachusetts, less religious place. I don't care what variable you're looking at. And this is really weird. I mean, if you're looking at longevity, self-reported happiness, crime rates, smoking rates, and so forth. Uh, Everything good is more common in the less religious states than in the most religious states. So that suggests that religiosity is predictive of lower levels of human flourishing. But Ed Diener, one of the great founders of positive psychology, and Louis Tay, his geeky, stats-oriented psych graduate student, worked with me in mining those data a little further. Because it turns out that those highly religious states are also low-income states,
Okay.
as well as high smoking states. And if you control for income, then you take out the negative relationship between the religiosity of a place and the well-being of its people. That relationship flips to slightly positive. That is, high religiosity is predicting greater human flourishing, but only to a small extent across place. So, what's really true then if we have conflicting data from the aggregate comparisons and from comparisons across individuals? I think it's the individual data that matters most. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's where life is lived. And by the way, we see this same paradoxical finding when we look at in other realms, like, uh, for example, do wealthy people vote Republican or Democrat? If you look across individuals, except in this last presidential election, which is an anomaly, wealthier individuals are more likely to vote Republican. No surprise there. They want to control your taxes. But if you compare the wealth of a state, you find that wealthy states like Oregon and Massachusetts are more likely to vote Democrat than poor states like Mississippi and Alabama. So you get exactly the opposite finding. Okay, so does high income predict Republican or Democratic leanings? I think it's the individual data that
Uh,
is most predictive. But anyway, we've gotten a little geeky here, but I hope it's clear.
that's part of what we're trying to do is create space in the church where we can get a little bit geeky and try to find some both interesting
Yeah.
and relevant things to bring to the church. So let me ask, I didn't send you this question in advance, but is there any practical advice that you would have for clergy, for churches on how to promote flourishing? Obviously, churches vary greatly, so that, wealthy, poor, location, all these other factors you're talking about. But are there some general practices that churches should be encouraged to pursue to promote flourishing among their members and their communities?
If I presume correctly that religious engagement predicts human flourishing because it engenders a social support network, people who care for one another and are there for one another when crunch time comes in their life. Then one thing the church can do is everything it can to encourage those human connections, those support networks through congregational progressive dinners, adult ed programming. I mean, any way you think about it, uh, get after church coffees, pizza Sundays after church, all those things that
Yep,
bring
small groups.
people together. But then, what else? The faith can be a place for having a sense of meaning and purpose about life, a place where the preached message is one of grace and love and acceptance for who you are as you are, of hope that no matter what terrible thing may come, in the end, the very end, all shall be well and all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well. That sort of messaging can contribute to a healthy psychological person. And by the way, that healthy psychology, if you will, and that active religious faith is also predictive of longevity. If people live healthy lives, are socially connected, are emotionally healthy, they're more likely to outlive those who are not.
I think that's a good place to stop. Although I would love to maybe have a part two conversation
Yeah.
and dive deeper. There's so many fascinating connections here. But thank you, Dave, for your time and your ministry of communicating psychology in various forms and sharing some of that ministry with us today.
Thank you very much, Drew. It's been a pleasure. And if anybody wants to read more about any of these subjects, davidmyers.org will take you there. All you have to do is spell Myers correctly, David, Myers.org.
Yeah, we don't want misinformation on spelling your last name here.
Yeah, there often is. Thank you, Drew, so much for welcoming me into your conversation. It's great to be with
Thank
you
you.
again.